Yes,
To
yes.
refresh your class.
No, it wasn't really that. So, anyways, welcome everybody who's on our live stream, along with those who are Zooming. We've been discussing for the last couple of minutes an additional class since Cantor Jackie and I are taking a break from our Tuesday Tefillah class because she's out of town. I said that I would add a class on Tuesday, June 30th at 5 o'clock, and that will be an understanding of how the prayer book was put together and the ideas behind why the prayer book is laid out the way it is laid out. So it's going to be both a geography class of the Siddur and a philosophical underpinnings of what the geography intends. And I will send an email to Seth. Oops. All right, whoever's doing live stream has to mute yourself. Tuesday, June 30th at 5 o'clock. And that will be an understanding of how the prayer book was put together and the ideas behind why the prayer book is laid out the way it is laid out. So it's going to be both a maybe that's me. Hold on a second. Siddur and a philosophy. Okay. It was me. You like that? Okay. It's because I don't have Tolly nearby to help me manage things. Okay, so with that, we will put the Tefillah class aside. Rosie, thank you for adding more to my plate. I appreciate it.
I didn't mean to do that.
No, I'm just teasing.
Only if you want to.
You know I can't say no. So,
or it could be at a later time. That's
no,
fine.
No. It's good because I'm taking off in July for a few weeks. So I might as well load up June and then have a couple weeks off. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen with all of you. Today's Lunch and Learn is Parshat Shlach Lecha, a great parsha. Could everybody see that? Let me just close out of other things so that there's not okay, now wait, there we go. Okay, now let me make this big. Okay, could everybody see it? Yeah. Okay.
Can you make it bigger?
Can I make it bigger?
Larger? Yeah.
Sure. How's that?
That's one way. Thank you.
Of course. Happy to check in with those whose eyes are getting old and tired and can't see so well because age is creeping up on them. Just kidding, Barry. Just kidding.
I just lowered my neck.
Okay, so the Torah portion Shlach Lecha deals primarily with the spies. Moshe sending out 12 spies to reconnoiter the land in order to conquer it from the inhabitants. And as you know the story, 10 spies come back and say, yeah, the land is indeed good, but we cannot conquer it. And two of the spies come back and say, what are you talking about? Of course we can conquer it because God has promised us the land. The two spies are Joshua and Caleb. The 10 spies, each of them lose their lives along with the punishment that the Israelites will have to wander in the wilderness for the additional 38 plus years. And they will all die out, and a new generation will be born, one that will hopefully have greater faith in themselves and in God. So that's what the essence of the Torah portion is about. And the first text that we're going to look at is from Rabbi Israel Morgenstern of Pilov, grandson of Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotk's. But before we do that, let's join together the blessing we say for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay. So we have this first text that is the actually opening verse of our Torah portion, Shlach lecha anashim veyaturu et eretz Canaan asher ani noten livnei Yisrael ish echad lemateh avotav tishlachu kol nasi bahem. Send men to scout the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelite people, send one man from each of their ancestral tribes, each one a chieftain among them. Al, I see you first. Up in front of my screen, would you be willing to read the Rashi commentary?
Sure. Rashi comments, why does the story of the scouts follow the story of Miriam being smitten with leprosy? She was afflicted for the slanderous speech that she spoke against her brother, yet these wicked ones saw and did not take the lesson.
Okay, let's pause there. So what's Rashi doing?
Well, the Torah reads in order. The last part of Bechukosai, right?
Yeah.
Talked about
No, Bahalotecha.
That's right. Talked about how Miriam had said some bad things and was smitten with leprosy as a punishment, I think, and Moses went and prayed, please heal her. Why does this story follow so quickly upon that one?
Excellent. Good. There's a principle that the rabbis teach us. Ein mukdam umuchar batorah. Ein mukdam umuchar batorah means that though the Torah may be laid out in what is an apparent chronological order, one thing happening after the other, happening after the other. The fact is, the rabbis say that that's not actually the way the chronology necessarily took place. That the Torah is not intending to show us chronologically one thing from the next. It has other hidden meanings, and Rashi is alluding to one of those other hidden meanings. What he's teaching us here is he says, we cannot read the story of the spies without first understanding that story through the lens of the story of Miriam and her cursing her brother Moshe. That's the essence of this commentary, that one story impacts the other in terms of the way that we're going to read the story. Is that clear? So the question, of course, is what happened with Miriam? And we know with Miriam, she and Aaron cursed their brother. We looked at that last week in our Lunch and Learn class. And what does that then perhaps offer us in terms of better understanding the spy story? Okay, I'll continue.
Is the purpose of this verse really to show us the wickedness of these people? Rather, a deep truth is revealed in Rashi's words. If someone does not wish to see the truth, nothing, not even presenting it directly in front of them, will make a difference.
Okay, pause there. So again, the first question we have to ask ourselves is not about how this statement relates to the spies, but rather, how does this statement relate to what Miriam and Aaron said about their brother? So let's ask and answer that question. How does this statement actually refer back to the story of Miriam and Aaron vis-a-vis Moshe? Do you remember what their complaints were about Moshe?
Is it about his wife?
Two things. Number one is about the woman that he married. Well, we don't know what they were concerned about because the text doesn't tell us. And there's actually a very interesting midrash that says that their comment about Tzipporah was not a comment negative to Tzipporah. It was actually a comment negative to Moshe. That Moshe, as leader of the Jewish people, of the Israelite nation, spent much more time focused on his responsibilities to the people of Israel, thereby not spending the time that he needed to taking care of his wife and kids. And their comment was really about Moshe as a husband and as a father. So, that's one possibility. The other possibility is the second statement they made, which was, why is it that God speaks to Moshe and not to us? And that was feelings of trying to belittle Moshe and saying that Moshe is taking too much for himself and not sharing in the responsibility. So the question, of course, is what is it that they did not see? Here, if someone does not wish to see the truth, nothing, not even presenting it directly in front of them, will make a difference. What's the truth that Miriam and Aaron were not able to see about Moshe and his relationship to God and the Jewish people? I don't know either.
Yeah. We can only speculate.
It's true.
They saw the evidence, right? They saw the evidence in front of them time after time of the importance of that relationship that Moses had with Hashem. And in fact, we know that Hashem did speak directly to Aaron, or it says that, and God spoke to Aaron saying, or directed him. So Miriam had maybe a bigger grudge that she felt she was one of the most important people, and why didn't she get the same kind of treatment as her brothers did? Maybe it was sexism, who knows? But even though they've seen time after time the value in the relationship, it didn't matter. It didn't matter. They were still ticked off, and they were going to express their disappointment.
Good. So their inability to recognize that God's unique relationship with Moshe was just that, a unique relationship with Moshe. And that unique relationship to Moshe didn't in any way detract from or diminish the role that Miriam and Aaron played in the life of the Jewish people. In fact, the Midrash tells us that Miriam played a rather significant role, that she was the source of Torah in her own way, that the water that she brought in Miriam's well, when she died, they were left without water. So there were things, according to the tradition, that Miriam played an instrumental role in, and yet she only saw out of her own insecurities that she wanted what her brother Moshe had. And that's the inability to see the truth. Our truth is, what is our own experience with God or with our fellow human beings, and that's different than others' experiences, and we have to live with those differences and can't expect everybody to have exactly the same. So, yeah.
It's very interesting. At the beginning of chapter 12, but Tidaber Miriam Aharon, it's
singular.
Mm-hmm. Aaron didn't say, it's not in the plural.
Yes.
It's singular female and Aaron. So he just kind of went along with this.
Perhaps that's certainly the way that the text looks, and according to the punishment, because Miriam was the only one who got punishment, it seems like Aaron went along. Okay. Let's go back to, now that we understand how to view the experience of Miriam and Moshe and Aaron, now we can take that and try to more deeply understand the experience of the spies. Go ahead, Al.
Their eyes are clouded, and so they do not see. This is what Rashi emphasized. These wicked ones saw. They saw with their own eyes, not relying on rumors, nor on written reports, yet nevertheless, they did not take the lesson.
Okay, so what is he saying here? How is he understanding vision? How is he understanding sight? How is he understanding what the spies saw and didn't see? What did the spies see?
They saw a land flowing with milk and honey, and yet they didn't see it. They saw they saw what they considered, I think they went in with a bad attitude. And nothing was going to change their minds. Maybe. Many of them came back fearful. And so they had missed the point, especially after they'd been instructed that, God was going to be with you. You were going to get this land. And despite that, they still saw.
So they saw with their eyes physically.
Saw what they, right.
Good. They saw with their eyes physically, but they didn't connect what they saw to what they knew and understood, what the lessons and the promises of God and Moshe were. They saw in the immediate, they weren't able to understand in the long run what that all meant to them. They saw only with their physical sight and not with their insight, not with their ability to take all of the various lessons that were taught to them by Moshe and God and incorporate them into what it was they saw. Yeah, Ziggy.
So the lesson to be learned here is, so they didn't have faith, obviously, that it's going to be okay. The giants are not going to beat the Israelites, whatever. But if it was all on faith, then what's the purpose even to send these spies over there? If you're not going to believe what they're going to say, why bother?
What a great question. Yeah, why did God bother even sending the spies in the first place when God had already said to them, hey, I'm going to give you this land? When all sending the spies now does is create a roadblock, a difficulty.
Another test of faith.
Yeah, perhaps it was a test. It was a way of God trying to say that although I promised you the land, there's a partnership involved here. You have to do something also. You have to be willing to take hold of your future. You can't just rely on me. And taking hold of your future is assessing the present, understanding the circumstances in which you are in, and then trying to come up with a plan that will allow you to take charge of your destiny, knowing in the back of your mind that I have promised this to you, and that as long as you take hold of your destiny, it will work out. And for that, the spies were not able to do it. George.
Yeah. Well, you guys have been hitting on sort of what I was thinking, but one thing was, everything was supplied to them in the desert, food and spiritual and you name it. And now the idea is, okay, it's a great land, but you've got to work it. There's great crops you could have, but you've got to do it. So you got to get down to the physical level. And I don't know, just figure the rest out. But
yeah, right. Just because God, somebody gives us a job and says, Richard Camras, you are quite capable of doing this job. I have full faith in you that you are going to be successful mastering this project or whatever it is. Now go to it. And then
subsidized now.
What's that?
You'd be fully subsidized now, but here's a different opportunity that you've got to.
Well, whatever it is, whether I'm fully subsidized.
We're not going to supply everything to you anymore. Here's an opportunity.
Yes, I've been given the job. That's what I've been given. Now, that job, I have to then do the work in order to make that job. There were 15 candidates, and I was the one who was chosen. Just because I was chosen to take the job doesn't mean that now I don't have to do the work. I still have to do the work. And that the Israelites are not willing to do. They're not willing to expend the energy. They see, but they don't really see. They don't see with their hearts. They don't see with their minds. They don't see in a faithful way. Okay. Go ahead, Al. Finish this little passage. Reb Nachman of Bratslav. You're muted, Al.
Thank you. I'm just trying to help you out there. Okay, Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav taught, Niftechu Hashamayim V'ara Marot Elokim. The heavens opened, and I saw visions of God. The initial letters spell Emunah, faith. When one has faith, one sees.
It's pretty cool, isn't it? That if you look at each of the letters of that phrase, they spell emunah. So seeing, he's teaching us, Reb Nachman of Bratslav, is not seen with our eyes. It's seen with what?
Our hearts?
Yeah, it's seen with our hearts. It's seen that which is not seeable. And what is not seeable in Jewish life? God. We can't see God, but that doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. Just because we don't have evidence. And in the desert, in the wilderness, as George said, the Israelites were given everything. They had firsthand ability to see the presence of God in the acts of God's miraculous gifts, the manna, the cloud, the pillar of fire, the splitting of the sea, the, all the things that God gave them. Now, when they enter the land, God is still going to be there, but just not in the same way that God was with them in the wilderness. And in that kind of scene, you have to have faith. You have to believe, right? The entering the land of Israel was putting the Israelites on the edge of faith because God wasn't present in the same way that God was present before. And in that moment, they curled up in a ball and died. They couldn't do it. They couldn't manage it. They needed something far more present than what God was willing to give them. All right. Rosie, would you read Rabbi Jonathan Slater?
What does it mean to see clearly? What does it mean to see the truth? It might mean to be free of bias and habit, of fear and desire.
Okay, so let's just pause there for a second. What's he jumping in and adding here? To see the truth, it might mean to be free of bias and habit, of fear and desire. Read this not in the context of the story of the spies, but in your own lives. What does it mean to see with bias and habit, with fear and desire, and without bias and habit, fear and desire? Right? Place it in the context of what's happening in our country today. How do people see with bias and habit versus without bias and habit?
To see the whole picture of exactly what's going on, open your eyes to what the reality is now versus what it used to be. Time has changed, and we come to a point in our lives that we have to change our ways, obviously, because things are not working the way they're supposed to. And COVID is making us see that.
Great. Other examples? Anybody else want to jump in? Ellen.
So we go in with preconceived notions of how we think it's going to be, and then that's what we see. It doesn't matter what's really out there, like the clouded vision in the previous passage. We're going in with, how we think people are, how we think it's going to be, and then that's exactly what we see.
Great. There's been lots of examples in the newspapers recently. One that pops up into my mind as Ellen was talking and Rosie was talking is the quarterback of the New Orleans Saints. When he came out against Colin Kaepernick's decision to kneel during football games, the way that he saw that was through his eyes, through his lens, and what he saw was an act against the flag and an act against patriotism. He didn't see it the way that Colin Kaepernick saw it, nor did lots of people, right? You can say the whole NFL, not just Drew Brees, but many in the NFL, because now all of a sudden people are saying in the NFL that if a player wants to kneel, that doesn't necessarily mean that player doesn't feel patriotism towards the United States of the United States of America. That act of kneeling for Colin Kaepernick and for other players was simply a statement of protest against what they perceived as police brutality against African Americans, not against patriotism of the U.S. Now Drew Brees sees that act differently. Now the NFL sees that act differently. I'm not judging here. I'm not explaining or understanding how one sees or one should see. All I'm simply stating is that's an example of the ability to now see without preconceived biases, judgments, and fears. Yeah, George.
Supposing they're playing, get away from this a second. They're playing Hatikva, in the synagogue or some event. Somebody takes a knee. How would you interpret that?
How would I interpret it? Well, again, that's a great example, George. How I interpret it is going to be through the lens of my own biases and judgments and fears, right? And habits. How the other person who's taking a knee during Hatikva may interpret it, I won't know unless I say to that individual, what does taking a knee during the recitation of Hatikva mean to you? Not how I understand it, but how you understand it.
You can't come in with a blank slate on every decision, or it take forever.
And you're absolutely right. We as human beings always carry.
So you can come to a conclusion. Otherwise, it'd be impossible to arrive at.
Yeah. Here's another example. So I saw the rioting in the streets, the looting in the streets, and I saw the protests. And I was aghast at the rioting and the looting. And I said to myself, I understand protesting. I don't understand looting and rioting.
I do.
And then I did some research and I listened to a variety of different Black speakers, and I read articles. And while I don't agree with the looting and I don't agree with the rioting as an act of protest, I now have a better understanding of why the rioting and the looting occurred. I can still not agree with the outcome, but now that I have removed my biases and fears and judgments, having learned more from the perspective of African Americans who shared where that looting and rioting came from, I have a better understanding and then can enter into dialogue with that community in a different way than I may have entered into dialogue with them before hearing their voices.
System there is.
What's that?
Good idea. You name it, I can understand it. That doesn't mean that, I see the point of view. Everybody's got an opinion. No, some things are right and some things are wrong.
I don't know about that. Right and wrong are not absolutes. From a philosophical standpoint, we know that there is never such a thing as a simple right and a simple wrong. There are always shades, not always, but oftentimes shades. And there are lots of things that we bring to what we see as truth that is our truth and not somebody else's truth. And that has to do with biology, and that has to do with genetics, and that has to do with environment, and that has to do with experiences of our life. So I don't know, George, I'm not sure I would agree with a simple, there's a truth and there's not a truth. There's a right and a wrong.
But isn't there, you were taught right from wrong growing up as a kid, and you were taught the lessons that you're supposed to do and the ones you're not supposed to do. So there is a right and a wrong way of doing things, because going out to rob somebody is not the right way, obviously, and that's wrong. And then going to help somebody put a grocery bag in the car, or they need to lift a heavy object, that's the right way to do things. So there is a right.
But that just depends on how you're raised. If you were raised with these great values, that's one thing. But if your parents didn't direct you in any way, or if they spoke against a certain race, or, it really just depends on what, like you said, the environment and how you grew up. We're not all raised with.
Exactly, Ellen. If I was raised in a home of Nazi SS officers, then I was raised in a home that taught me that Jews are cockroaches and Jews need to be killed and destroyed and gassed. That's the right thing that I was taught to learn. That if I see a Jew in the street, right, if I am raised in a Hamas household, then I have learned that all Israelites, all Israelis and Jews need to be killed for stealing the land. That's what I've learned is right. So I think Ellen's comment is an important comment, that right and wrong is hard to determine. Are there some absolutes to right and wrong? Or is everything relative? No, I don't think everything is relative. But we also have to understand right and wrong through the biases of our life's experiences.
But the
Yeah,
Judeo-Christian tradition is such as very clearly tells you what's right or wrong. It's very clear that whatever that SS guy was being taught is wrong. That the Hamas guy that wants to kill Israel is wrong. It doesn't matter what they're taught at home, and that's to me of no consequence to justify his actions and behavior just because his parents mistaught him. The fact of the matter is there's right and wrong. And everything else is just commentary, really. It's just that simple. These people in Los Angeles or wherever they were, they took your property. If they came to your house and took away your car, you wouldn't be happy about it. Just like those poor shop owners lost their property. So there's a right and there's a wrong. In that case, these people were wrong. No matter why they were doing what they're doing, it's irrelevant to me. You know, I mean, I can always find excuses to misbehave, but that's the Yetzer Hara. So my Yetzer Tov says to me, no, you can't do that because that's wrong. You know, that's to me, that's that simple. I can't justify misbehavior under any conditions.
Shelley, good.
I think
that's the example that you gave of growing up in a household where you're taught hatred and you're taught disrespect. That's the example of what you're taught. But I think that there is, as Ziggy said, I think that there is a matter of right and wrong that we learn as Jews. This is part of what we're studying in the Torah. We're studying and we're learning that there are, from our point of view, all right, and I can say that's our point of view, that stealing is wrong, looting is wrong. And in other societies that might be acceptable, but that doesn't mean that in those societies that it's right.
No question. And again, go back, watch the tape of this class. I never said that I thought that the looting and the rioting was right. What I said
I heard what you said, and you said, if I were brought up in such and such a house.
No, that's not what I said. What I said is, after listening to people explain the rioting and the looting, I said, I still disagree with the act, but I have a better understanding of what led them to behave that way. I never said I agree with the act of rioting and looting.
No, I did not.
What I said is I'm trying to understand the people's actions, and my biases were focused in one way before I listened to and learned from African Americans. Now my judgments have expanded. I can see different stories. I still don't agree with rioting and looting. You're absolutely right. But I can better understand what led some people, not all people. There were plenty of criminals out there as well. But I could understand how violence may lead right from a certain life experience where I can disagree with the violence and say to people, that's not the solution to the problem, but I can understand where that violence may come from. That's all I'm saying here.
Yeah.
I think some of the looters knew they were doing wrong, but went ahead and did it anyway.
I would hope that all of the looters knew that they were doing wrong.
At least some of them, I think, were.
Well, I would hope that all of them understand that the act of looting and taking from innocent people is a wrong act.
But I think, sorry.
Ellen and then Miriam.
I think what you were saying just prior to that is that you have an open mind. It's a Musar mind. You're open to seeing what's coming from the other person. You know, where is this person coming from? And because you're open, many people are not open to hearing any side except what they believe. So I think that's.
Yeah, I want to know the story behind the action. I could disagree with the action. I can say to the person all the time, but unless I hear that person's story, and unless that person knows that I care about him or her and their story, We'll never get beyond just the action. Miriam.
I think we're talking about two different things here. Rosie had said something about parents taught us right from wrong. And I think, Rabbi, you were responding to that comment when you gave as an example, Hamas households and Nazi SS households. That's one thing. And definitely so that what you were saying is that what you're taught at home is right and wrong may not really be the correct what's right and what's wrong. Then on this other aspect that we're talking about is what does it mean to see the truth? It might mean to be free of bias and habit, free in desire. If someone steals an apple from a store because they are starving, yes, stealing is wrong, but dying of starvation is also wrong. So we need to understand the underlying reason of why someone does what they do. For the examples that we're talking about now, the Confederate monuments that are up, that are now being discussed to take down, not to destroy them, but take them down. But that's where they've always been. That just because it's been there for a while doesn't mean that it's right to continue it there. And now we need to understand that for some people, seeing a statue of Robert E. Lee, who fought against the United States and fought in favor of slavery, how that appears to people whose grandparents and great-grandparents were enslaved. So we just have to open our eyes to all of it.
Thank you, Miriam, for clarifying my points in the arguments and helping us navigate where we were going from and to. Okay, so going back to this passage, right? What does it mean to see clearly? It means to be free of bias and habit, of fear and desire. The question is, can we ever be free of bias and habit and fear and desire? Is that a state of potential? Is that a state that we can achieve? Or is it about understanding that we can't help but view everything that we see out of our own experiences, which come with fear and desire and bias, etc. And if we know that our experiences are going to lend a certain color to how we see things, then what can we do in response to that? Well, it's as you've said, it's being able to see with the lens of another person. Well, we can never really see with the lens of another person, but the more that we get to know a person, the more that we get to hear her story, the more that we understand his life experiences, the better attuned we may be to what our own biases and our own fears and our own desires may actually look like. Rosie, you want to continue? You have to unmute. There you go.
Yeah.
So it's to see clearly is to recognize.
To see clearly is to recognize the contingent impermanence of all things, of all events and phenomena. To see the truth is to recognize the interconnection of all things. To see the sense, the past, to see past the sense of a separation, to see past the sense of a separate self, to experience the oneness of all creation, the absence of observer and observed, subject and object.
Okay, so this is a very mystical, Kabbalistic idea here. What is he saying here? What's he alluding to? He's working on two planes here. On the one hand, there is a clear reality that my reality, my experience, my sense of self is unique and different and separate than your reality, your experience, and your sense of self. But there's another way of understanding the world. And that other way of understanding the world is we're really not separate. We're not distinct selves. That there is only one reality. And what is that one reality? That one reality is the one reality of God. That's all there is. That we are all connected to this unified feature of God, and that our separate reality is actually a a false sense of individuality, because in reality, I am no more separate from you, and my actions are impact you just as much as they impact me. Right? That is a different way of seeing the world and understanding reality. One that is not rational, but mystical in nature, metaphysical in nature. Not the one that we normally, right, conduct our lives by, but one that is nevertheless a potential way of being in this world. What would it present if that's the way that we conducted ourselves? If we thought more about the interconnectedness of our being than the separateness of our being, what might that mean to how we construct our lives? Well, perhaps it might mean that before I do anything, I ask myself, how does this act that I am doing impact others? And who are all of the others that this act impacts? What are the ramifications of my action extended almost infinitely out into the world? Do we do that normally? Like when you had breakfast today, were you concerned how your breakfast impacted infinitely out every other life on this universe? Of course not. You had your breakfast. Could you eat your breakfast and also consider the impact that eating your breakfast has on all of life and everything in the universe? Well, you couldn't live like that all the time, right?
No.
You'd probably not be able to go and do anything. But how do we take a little bit of that experience into our daily existence? Certainly in communication with other people.
So when I work with the children at the school, I take into consideration the whole class that I'm working in. And I'm assigned to a specific student with disabilities. And I watch my behavior and what I say, because the whole class is going to hear what I'm saying to that student. So I try to go about it in a very non-judgmental way, and to move forward in a positive way to have the task completed that I want, the end result for that student. So when I say something and I know that all the students are listening, because they do, little kids hear everything you say and take that very seriously. So I watch every step that I'm doing and the things that I'm saying, because I know it's going to impact the rest of them.
Good. So you take a much more holistic approach. You're working with a specific child, but in reality, you know that you're working with an entire class. And ultimately, that child's whole family and all those kids' families and everybody else. Shelley.
There's another approach which we build into our lives as Jews. When we light the Shabbat candles, or just before we light Shabbat candles, which is really kind of about us, and we bless our kids, we bless our family, but on the side of those candles, before we light them, there's a little blue box. At least there was when I was growing up. And what we're doing is when we take the coins out of our pockets, because we're not supposed to carry money on Shabbat, we take the coins out of our pockets, we put some of those coins in that box. We are stretching out and empathizing with other people in other parts of the world. And this can be just, for Jewish National Fund, or it can be for people who need a drink of water, clean water in Africa or elsewhere. So this
Great example.
This is what Jewish tradition tends to do. We stretch out to the extent that we can. We stretch out beyond ourselves.
Great. So within our faith, right, it's built in that as much as we do things that are individually based, our tradition holds that sense of interconnectedness, and ritual is one of the areas which allows us to fluctuate between the individual and the communal. Great, thank you. All right, let's keep going. Rosie, you have to unmute yourself.
Apparently, it was the challenge to see clearly that was presented to the scouts and the Israelites. And it is the challenge that we face as well. We are sent out each day to scout out the land, to experience ourselves in God's world, not as owners, not as subjects, but as objects of God's concern and care, desire and will, and ultimately as expressions of God in the world. As we see more clearly, we might come to sense our lives freed of hunger and fear, of greed and anger, open to living in God's light and love.
So, right, we are, in other words, in the way in which Rabbi Slater is reading this, we are the scouts. Every day we are asked to go out into the world and explore the land and see what kind of land it is, a good land or not a good land. And we can't help but go out into the world with this understanding that we need to take care of ourselves in this world. There are wild beasts, there are giants, there are monsters, and we need to do everything that we can to take care of ourselves in this world. But there's another way we can go out into this world, right? And the other way that we go out into this world is to see that we are, right, expressions of God in this world, as is everybody else. And how would that then change the way in which we interact with the world itself and all the people who are in the world? Right? That's really the challenge that Rabbi Slater is placing at our front step. So, questions to ponder. How do you remember to look beyond your own individual actions to understand how your actions impact the world? Right? How do you do that? How do you sense yourself in that regard? That is, are you more aware of what it is that you do or the outcomes of your action? Do you sense that your life is in the wilderness, as in distance from the fruitful, bounteous, Or do you understand that you live in a protected, fed, nurtured, sustained by the miraculous world? Which way do you approach life? Anybody want to tackle any of these questions? I know these are big questions to ponder.
Number 6 is Judaism. The beliefs, you have this belief, now it comes into focus.
So
explain a little more, George. What do you mean by number 6 is Judaism?
Well,
there's 2 sentences there. I believe it when I see it, or I'll see it when I believe it.
Agnostic will say.
What's that?
Agnostic says, well, I'll believe all this stuff if I, can prove it, if I can see it. And the second version is, you get your belief in order, and then it comes into focus.
So what you're saying, if I understand you, is that the second statement is a statement that Judaism holds as a quality of desire as opposed to the first statement?
Well, no. In other words, if you hypothetically, you learn Torah, you spend all these years, learning this. Now you see how things come together. The first one is like the agnostic. How many times have I seen this? Well, I'll believe it when I see it, prove it. How do you know this exists, that exists, this happened, that happened, so on,
So when I believe
they never come into focus, by the way, they never see it.
Okay, so in the second instance, when I believe that we're all interconnected, when I believe that we're all one, when I believe that the reality in which I live, which is one of definition of the self, is not the only way to live, then I can see in a way that I've never seen before.
You see how things come together.
Barry, were you about to say something before?
Yeah, I looked at the first question, and I look at my computer and I have this phrase from Musar Anava: no more than my space, no less than my place. And so when I reflect on my day every evening, I try to answer this question in a way. I try to look at what did I do during the day, and was I doing it in a self-interest, or was I looking out for the other? And I've only been doing this for a couple of years now, but that question is a really interesting question to ponder, because we act and react all the time, and we sometimes don't take the time to think about what we're doing and how we're doing it.
Thank you. Lauren.
I'm looking at number 5, where I don't look at the miracles around. I mean, you see a tree, you see a mountain, you see the ocean, you see the land, and I don't think of it as miraculous, and yet I know it is. So I have to work to know God. Like, how did it all get here? Like, we just planted a little tree in our front yard last year because the other one blew down, and now it's this big tree. How did it get to be this big tree? I've watched it every single day, and I've watched my grandson grow since the moment he came into this earth, and he's this walking little human being. How did that miracle happen? Who made that happen? So I have to work to know the miracle of God. That's where I am.
Anybody else want to tackle any of these questions? It's good that I have a few more texts, but clearly at 12:58 we're not going to make these other texts. So that'll be for next year. Anybody have any last comment of a question here that they want to address? Okay, well, so then our homework is, how do we see what is right in front of us? Not just with our eyes, right? And not just from the perspective of our own biases and our own fears and our own desires, but how do we see that which is in front of us with the fullness of what is? That there is a deep interconnection between me and whatever it is in the world that I am seeing, and whoever it is in the world that I am connecting to. And we're far closer than we are apart. And how might my actions then demonstrate that sense of interconnectedness as opposed to singularity, which is the way more often we tend to live our lives. All right, everybody. Well, I will see you, those interested. Next week is our, wait, let me just stop sharing the screen for a second. If I can figure out how to do that. Okay. Let me give you the schedule of classes. So next week, for the next 2 Mondays, I'm teaching spiritual conversations at 4 o'clock. Next week, the 23rd, there is no tefillah class. Next week, the 25th, Thursday, is the last lunch and learn that I'm going to be teaching for a while, because I'm going to be taking a break in July. And on the 30th, Tuesday the 30th, is now going to be an additional tefillah class, thanks to Rosie, on the structure of the Siddur and how its geography introduces us to the ideology and theology that the rabbis had in mind when they created the Siddur. And that'll be at 5 o'clock. As opposed to 5:30, so that, as Paul asked, we have a little bit more time to go through the Siddur than just an hour. Okay, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks